Hey everybody, this is Chelsea with my second presentation on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So some of the objectives that I will be covering are habitat loss, specifically with coral reefs and mangrove forests, as well as recent trends and drivers of habitat loss, and I'll also be talking about landscape fragmentation. So habitat loss is what occurs when a habitat is changed into a form that cannot support the organisms that originally inhabited that area. Humans can cause habitat loss with the creation of new urban areas, clearing of lands for agriculture, inducing climate change that can affect a habitat, and by pollution. Habitat loss can be seen in many different forms in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. There's been a loss of mangrove forests, and humans have impacted the water in a variety of ways that are damaging to the ecosystem. Sometimes habitat loss can be harder to recognize and understand when the habitat is in a marine environment because a lot of the habitat damage is not something that you can see really clearly. So habitat loss in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is caused by changes in ocean temperature, ocean acidification, agricultural runoff, and various different pollutants. And many of these factors combine and result in serious habitat damage that affects the entire ecosystem. We can see the effects of habitat loss in coral reefs. Coral reefs are made up of polyps, and on these polyps are algae. The algae provide the polyps with food and are part of what makes coral the color that it is. The combined effects of warmer or even colder water temperatures and more acidic water that is caused by climate change, as well as pollutants that enter the water, cause algae to unattach from the polyps. And then because the algae are no longer on them, those polyps lose their food source, causing the coral to lose its color. And that process is known as coral bleaching. And this picture explains the details more. The effects of this change in habitat trickle down throughout the ecosystem because coral reefs provide food and habitat for many other organisms that live in the water, which is why coral bleaching is such an important conservation issue. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, it's estimated that about 25% of known marine species are supported by coral reefs, so damage to these coral reefs could have large impacts. So there also has been habitat loss with mangrove forests. There are extensive mangrove forests within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and they've had a history of destruction and damage. Mangrove forests were dredged and filled to make room for more development, and that has been the main source of continued habitat loss for mangrove forests. This habitat loss has widespread effects over a wide area. Mangrove forests provide erosion protection, and they prevent sediments from drifting into the ocean. And mangrove forests are also home to a variety of birds, fish, and invertebrates. So you can see in this species how these fish are using the roots from the mangrove trees for habitat. And in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, there's also a really big fishing industry. And that fishing industry is supported by the mangrove forest because that's where the fish kind of grow up before they enter into the ocean. So onto some of the drivers of marine habitat loss. So drivers of habitat loss in marine ecosystems include fishing pressure, ocean acidification, temperature changes, pollution, eutrophication, circulation patterns, upwelling, storm events, pesticides, and poorly treated wastewater. Habitat change can be caused by many different specific things in different parts of the world. So, for example, amounts and types of agricultural runoff are going to be very different state to state as well as country to country, so the effects are going to be different in different areas of the world. And this picture shows all of the effects of agricultural runoff and how it can cause much larger issues with eutrophication. Fishing pressure is another driver of this habitat loss. So as technology has developed and changed over time, fishing practices have used these technologies to more efficiently fish. These more efficient practices have caused overfishing as well as damage to the ocean floor. Bottom trawling is a very destructive way of fishing that uses a net and weights that drag across the ocean floor and pick up anything that ends up in the net. This method of fishing results in a lot of bycatch and destroys many areas that provide species with food and shelter. So in this photo you can see before and after bottom trawling, and this really shows how it affects the seafloor habitat. A lot of habitat loss has also occurred based off of water quality. So coastal development has been a big driver in habitat loss in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. This sanctuary attracts many tourists as it is a beautiful destination to travel to, and because of that, there's been an increased interest in building hotels and apartment buildings on the coast to meet the want for easier water access. The construction of these, as well as the repair of structures that are used for shoreline protection, creates pollution that is easily carried into the waters. This development also pushes urbanization closer to the coastline, which causes habitat loss in the lands that lead up to that coastline. Erosion also is a driver of habitat loss in this sanctuary in two different ways. The first way is that there's a loss of shoreline habitat caused by storms and rising sea levels that have eroded the beaches, and most recently Hurricane Irma caused a lot of erosion. And the second way that erosion is causing habitat loss is that people have been trying to replenish the beaches with imported sand to make up for that erosion, and that poses a threat to nearshore and shoreline habitats. This imported sand can bury endangered sea turtle nests, as well as seagrass and hard bottom habitats, so it can have really big impacts on the ecosystem. So now a little bit into habitat fragmentation. So habitat fragmentation is the result of landscape change where habitats have been sectioned off into fragments. There are a few patterns that are seen in habitat fragmentation. Fragments that are larger tend to contain a higher variety of species than fragments that are smaller, as well as more rare species than smaller fragments. Fragments that are closer to other fragments tend to have larger populations of species too. So the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary can be seen as a fragmented habitat because the protections placed on it has prevented some damage to the ecosystem. So this large sanctuary contains a wide variety of species and it is very biodiverse. Large fragments also tend to have rare species, so within the sanctuary, threatened and endangered species are more common because of the protection of their habitat and resources. Seagrass meadows are a really important part of the habitat of many different organisms. Seagrass meadows are declining globally and that decline is mostly caused by various pollutants and climate change. In the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, there's a large fragment of seagrass meadows. Within this fragment, threatened and endangered species like sea turtles, manatees, egrets, queen conch, and Bahama sea stars are more prevalent. So that's one of those patterns of habitat fragmentation that we can see. And in this map, the green is seagrass meadows, so this is a really large fragment of seagrass meadows. So that was everything, and this is my works cited, so thank you for listening.